She sold everything she owned for a stagecoach ticket and 3 letters from a man named Thomas Redfield. She traveled 8 days across the frontier to marry him. But when the coach stopped, the man waiting in the yard was not Thomas Redfield. He had never heard that name. And Thomas Redfield had never existed. She was alone, $3 in her pocket, no way home, and a 6-year-old girl was about to call her mama. The stagecoach nearly tipped on its side when the wheel struck a deep rut, and Rosalie Bennett felt her heart slam hard against her ribs. For one terrible second, she thought this was how her new life would end, tossed into the mud of a place she had never seen, buried in a territory she could not name. But this is not where the story begins, no. This story begins nearly 2 months later on a cold autumn afternoon when a black carriage rolled up the dirt road to Whispering Creek Ranch, and a woman in a pressed dark dress stepped down with a folded document in her gloved hand. Margaret Caldwell did not knock. She did not wait. She stood in the yard with a county judge beside her and 2 men Rosalie had never seen, and she said the words that turned the air to ice. "I am here for the child. The judge has signed the order." Inside the cabin, 6-year-old Nettie Henshaw began to cry. Not the soft whimper of a child who dropped a toy, the ragged animal sound of a girl who understood exactly what was happening. Caleb Henshaw stood in the doorway. He did not reach for a weapon. He did not raise his voice. He simply filled the frame with his body shoulders, squared hands gripping the wood on either side, and spoke in a voice so low it barely carried past the porch. "Nobody steps through this door." Rosalie stood behind him. Her hands were still dusted with flour from the biscuits she had been making for Nettie that morning. She looked at Margaret. She looked at the judge. She looked down at her own trembling fingers. And she made a fist. This is how it all started, not with a love letter, not with a proposal, but with a stagecoach that dropped the wrong woman at the wrong ranch and a little girl who softly called her mama, 7 weeks earlier. Rosalie Bennett stood before 2 graves in Barton, Missouri, and said goodbye to everything she had ever known. The headstones were modest, wooden crosses with names carved shallow, already fading. William Bennett on the left, Mary Bennett on the right. Grass had grown over both mounds, thick and careless, the way the earth always moves on whether people are ready or not. She placed 2 wildflowers on the dirt, one yellow, one white. She did not cry. She had run out of tears for her parents long before this morning. Her father had died of fever when she was 16. Her mother had followed 2 years later, worn down by grief and labor, in the slow erosion of hope that comes from watching a life narrow instead of expand. Rosalie was 24 years old. She had no siblings, no land, no dowry, no inheritance beyond a Bible with a cracked spine and a name that meant nothing to anyone in this town except as an object of pity. She worked for the Pemberton family, laundry mostly, scrubbing other people's sheets and shirts until her knuckles cracked and bled in winter. Mrs. Pemberton was not cruel in the way some employers were, but she had a habit of reminding Rosalie of her place. A girl without family, without property, without prospects. That was how she said it. Without prospects. As though Rosalie were a plot of land too rocky to farm. And then there was Luther Kemp. Luther owned the tavern on Main Street. He was close to 50, heavy-set, with a red face and fingers like sausages. His wife had left him 3 years prior, walked out one morning and never came back, and the whole town whispered about it, but nobody said anything to his face because Luther bought rounds, and Luther extended credit, and Luther had a way of making himself necessary. He had been watching Rosalie for months, not with violence, not yet, but with the patient confidence of a man who believed that time was on his side. "She will run out of choices," he told the barber one afternoon loud enough for half the street to hear. "And when she does, she will come to me." One evening, walking home from the Pemberton house after dark, Rosalie heard heavy footsteps behind her. She turned and found Luther standing in the middle of the road, hat in hand, smiling the way a cat smiles at something small. He did not touch her. He did not need to. His eyes said everything. It was only a matter of time. That night, Rosalie sat on her narrow bed in the room she rented above the dry goods store, and she read the newspaper advertisement for the 11th time. Thomas Redfield seeks hard-working woman of good character for matrimony. Ranch established near Cedar Ridge, Montana Territory. Children welcome. Protestant preferred. There was nothing sweet in those words. No promises of love or laughter. Just need. Just duty. Just survival. But Rosalie had not been searching for poetry. She had been searching for a door, any door that led somewhere other than Luther Kemp's tavern. She wrote a letter that same night. Her handwriting was careful and steady, each word chosen like a seed planted in uncertain soil. She described herself honestly. She did not exaggerate her skills or her beauty. She said she was willing to work. She said she was not afraid of silence or solitude. She said she was looking for a place to belong. 3 weeks later, a reply arrived, then another, then a third. The handwriting was neat, polite, controlled. Thomas Redfield described Sunrise Valley Ranch in measured detail: cattle operation, garden plot, mountain views. He said he needed a woman who could endure winters and did not expect comfort. He never once mentioned love. He never once asked about her appearance. Rosalie read those letters so many times the paper softened at the folds. She studied every line for warmth and found little. But she also searched for dishonesty and found none. The words were careful, yes, but careful was not the same as false. She sold everything: her mother's remaining dresses, the small mirror that had hung on the wall, 2 quilts, a set of kitchen knives. Everything she owned converted into a stagecoach ticket and $5 in coin. She did not tell Luther Kemp she was leaving. She did not tell Mrs. Pemberton. She walked to the depot before sunrise with 1 suitcase, 3 letters folded inside, and the fragile belief that somewhere in Montana a man was waiting for her. She did not know that the letters she carried, the letters she had memorized word by word, were written by the hand of a man who had deceived 7 women before her. The journey west was supposed to take 5 days. It took closer to 8. 8 days of rough roads, cold nights, and the slow accumulation of distance between everything Rosalie had ever known and the vast unknown ahead. The stagecoach was cramped. An elderly widow sat across from her, hands folded around a small Bible, lips moving in silent prayer. A traveling salesman slept in the corner with his sample case on his chest. A young family with a colicky infant occupied the rear bench, the baby's cries punctuating every hour like a clock that never wound down. Rosalie watched the landscape change through the dust-covered window. Missouri's green fields gave way to open plains, and the plains stretched wider and flatter, until the horizon became a line drawn by God's own hand, straight and unbroken and impossibly far. She ate sparingly, bread and dried meat she had packed, water from stations along the route. She counted her money twice a day, a habit born from years of having too little to waste. On the second day, the sky turned black at noon. The storm came without warning. Thunder rolled across the plains like cannon fire, and rain struck the roof of the coach so hard the sound erased all conversation. The trail turned to mud. The wheels slipped. The driver cursed and whipped the horses, but the ground had become something alive and hostile, pulling at them, dragging them sideways. A crack like a rifle shot. The rear axle split. The stagecoach lurched to a stop at a small trading post in the middle of nowhere. The shopkeeper shook his head when the driver asked about repairs. "Axle is cracked clean through," he said. "Cannot fix that in this weather. 2 days at least, maybe 3. 2 days. Rosalie felt her stomach sink. Would Thomas Redfield think she had changed her mind? Would he assume she never meant to come? She slept on the wooden floor that night with her suitcase beneath her head. The widow prayed into the darkness. Wind shook the thin walls like an animal testing a cage. In the morning, Rosalie offered to help the shopkeeper's wife cook and clean in exchange for meals. She worked without complaint. She scrubbed pots and swept floors and kneaded bread dough until her arms ached. She had learned long ago that tears did not fill empty plates. It was during those 2 days at the trading post that Rosalie met Bertie Walsh. Bertie was young, maybe 20, with red hair cut short and freckles scattered across her nose like cinnamon on cream. She was also a mail-order bride, heading north to a settlement near the Canadian border. She carried 1 bag and a smile that appeared too quickly, the way smiles do on people who have learned to use them as shields. They talked while peeling potatoes in the kitchen. "First time going west?" Bertie asked. "First time going anywhere," Rosalie admitted. Bertie nodded, her knife moving in quick practice strokes. "I went west once before. Different territory, different man." Something in her voice made Rosalie stop peeling. "What happened?" Bertie set down her knife. She looked at the wall, then at the floor, then back at Rosalie. "The man I wrote to did not exist. The name was fake. The ranch was fake. Everything in those letters was invented by someone who wanted women to show up alone in places where nobody would hear them scream. Rosalie felt cold spread through her chest. His name was Virgil, Bertie continued quietly. Virgil Doss. He ran schemes like that across 3 territories, placing advertisements under different names, writing careful letters, drawing women out to where they had no money and no way home. Some he abandoned, some he sold to mining camps as labor. Some just disappeared. Bertie's hands were steady, but her voice was not. I got lucky. A family found me wandering on a road 2 days after I realized nobody was coming to meet me. They took me in, fed me, put me on a stage heading east. But I heard later that Virgil Doss was finally caught in Wyoming territory. 2 months ago. He is sitting in a jail cell right now. Rosalie swallowed hard. How many women? 7 that they know of, maybe more. That night, Rosalie lay on the floor and stared at the ceiling. She pulled out her 3 letters and held them close to the lantern light, searching for something, anything that would prove Thomas Redfield was real. The handwriting was neat. The details were specific. Cedar Ridge, Montana Territory, Sunrise Valley Ranch. Surely a con man would not include so many details. Surely a liar would be vaguer, would leave room for escape. She folded the letters carefully and put them back in her suitcase. She told herself Thomas Redfield was different. She told herself she was being sensible. But Bertie's words echoed in the dark, places where nobody would hear them scream, and a name she would not forget. Virgil Doss. 3 more days on the road. The repaired axle held but barely. The stagecoach groaned and swayed through mountain passes that grew steeper with each mile. Rosalie pressed her face to the window and saw Montana for the first time. It was vast, overwhelmingly, impossibly vast. Mountains rose in the distance like the spine of some sleeping creature. There were peaks already dusted with early snow. The valleys between them were golden with autumn grass, and the sky above was so wide and so blue, it seemed to have no end. Beautiful and terrifying. On the 5th day, the stagecoach slowed. Rosalie's heart began to pound. This was it, the place where she would begin again. She smoothed her dress. She checked her hair in the small reflection of the window glass. She pressed her hand against the letters in her suitcase one final time. The coach stopped before a weathered barn and a sturdy cabin built of log smoke rising from the stone chimney. Mountains loomed behind it. A split rail fence ran along the pasture. The land was rough and beautiful and utterly alone. A tall man stood near the barn, his hat shading his face. Whispering Creek Ranch, the driver called out. Rosalie frowned. She leaned forward. I am meant for Sunrise Valley Ranch, she said quickly, near Cedar Ridge. Thomas Redfield. The driver unfolded his manifest and squinted at the smudged ink. Says here, Whispering Creek Ranch for Miss Rosalie Bennett. He tapped the paper with a dirty finger. Company rules, miss. This is where the paper says to leave you. But that is not right. There must be a mistake. The tall man began walking toward the coach. His stride was steady and measured the walk of a man who covered ground without hurrying. As he came closer, Rosalie saw him clearly for the first time. He was not what she had imagined. He was perhaps 36, tall and broad-shouldered, with a face weathered by sun and wind, until the skin had turned the color of old leather. His jaw was strong and set. His eyes were the gray blue of a winter sky, sharp but not unkind. He wore a buckskin jacket over a faded work shirt, and his hands, when he removed his gloves, were calloused and scarred from years of work with rope and wood and iron. He looked like a man who had been carved from the mountain behind him. Rough, quiet, enduring. Ma'am, he said, stopping a few steps away, I am Caleb Henshaw. This is Whispering Creek Ranch. He looked at the suitcase the driver was already unloading. You look like you are searching for someone. I'm supposed to marry Thomas Redfield, Rosalie said, clutching her case, at Sunrise Valley Ranch. Caleb blinked once, just once. Then he said with the blunt simplicity of a man who did not waste words, I do not know any Thomas Redfield, and I did not send for a bride. The words struck her like cold water. Behind her, the driver tipped his hat. Company rules, miss. This is where the manifest says to leave you. He was already climbing back up to his seat. You cannot just leave me here, Rosalie cried. But the horses lurched forward. Within seconds, the stagecoach was rolling away, and the sound of wheels on dirt faded until there was nothing left but the wind and the vast indifferent silence of the Montana frontier. She stood alone in a cloud of red dust, her suitcase at her feet, $3 in her purse, and the slow, sickening realization that everything she had planned, everything she had risked, might have been built on nothing at all. She was delivered to the wrong ranch, and she did not know yet that this wrong ranch would give her everything she had once prayed for. Caleb Henshaw studied the woman standing in his yard the way he studied weather, carefully without rushing to judgment. She was young, younger than he had expected when the stagecoach first pulled up, though he had not expected anyone at all. Her dress was wrinkled from travel, and her hair had come loose from its pins, but her back was straight and her chin was level, and when she met his eyes, she did not look away. He respected that. A person who could hold a gaze after being stranded in the middle of nowhere had something in them worth noticing. "Well," he said at last, removing his hat, "seems there has been a mix-up. You cannot stand out here all evening. Come inside." Every lesson Rosalie had ever been taught told her to refuse. A decent woman did not enter a stranger's home without a chaperone, especially the home of a man who looked like he could wrestle a bear and win. But the sun was sinking fast. The mountain air was already cold enough to bite. She had no money for a hotel she could not reach, no horse to carry her there, and no idea where Sunrise Valley Ranch might even be, if it existed at all. "I suppose I have no choice," she said softly. He nodded once and led her toward the house. Inside the cabin was simple but clean. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall fire already crackling low. The smell of venison stew filled the air, rich and warm. A wooden table with 3 chairs sat near the kitchen. Shelves lined with jars and tin cans. A rifle mounted above the mantel. Everything in its place, everything functional. Nothing decorative except for one detail that Rosalie noticed immediately. On the far wall, small picture frames sat on a shelf turned face down, and on the windowsill a lace curtain yellowed by sun hung crookedly, the kind of curtain a woman would have chosen, not a man. Below it on a separate shelf, a chipped teacup sat apart from the others, as though someone had set it aside and no one had dared move it since. Rosalie did not ask. She did not need to. The cabin carried the memory of a woman in every quiet detail. Someone had lived here once. Someone had hung those curtains and chosen that cup and placed that picture on the shelf. And someone had turned it face down. Caleb poured coffee into a tin mug and set it on the table in front of her. He did not hand it to her directly. He placed it down and stepped back, giving her space, keeping distance between his body and hers. Rosalie noticed this. He was being careful not to frighten her. "Thank you," she said, wrapping her hands around the warm metal. Before she could take more than a sip, the front door burst open. A small girl ran inside like a gust of wind made human. Her dress was muddy at the hem, her boots caked with dirt, and her dark hair was tied into 2 loose pigtails that were more knot than braid. She was breathless, cheeks flushed, eyes bright with the urgent news that only a 6-year-old could consider life or death. "Papa Jake says Buttercup is better. He thinks she might eat by morning, and he said I could help feed her if I wake up early, and I told him I always wake up early because I do, Papa, you know I do." She stopped mid-sentence when she saw Rosalie, wide brown eyes, studying, not frightened, just endlessly, openly curious the way children are before the world teaches them to guard their expressions. "Nettie," Caleb said gently, "this is Miss Bennett. She is staying for supper." Nettie tilted her head slightly like a bird examining something new. "Are you lost?" Rosalie managed a faint smile, the kind of smile that costs something to produce. "Yes, sweetheart, I think I am." Nettie considered this with the gravity of a Supreme Court justice. "Papa finds lost calves all the time," she said seriously. "He always brings them home." Something inside Rosalie's chest tightened, a thread pulled taut between her ribs, connecting to something she did not yet have a name for. Caleb cleared his throat. "Wash up for supper, little bird." Nettie gave Rosalie one last curious look, then skipped toward the back of the cabin, her muddy boots leaving small prints on the floor that Caleb did not mention and did not seem to mind. When she was gone, Rosalie looked down at her coffee cup. Steam curled upward in the lamplight. The fire crackled softly, and for the first time since leaving Missouri, she did not feel completely alone. That night, Rosalie slept in the small room off the main cabin. It was clearly not a guest room. It was someone's room, or had been. The bed was narrow, but the quilt was thick, stitched in a pattern of blue and white stars. The curtains were the same yellowed lace as the ones in the kitchen. On the bedside table, a dried flower so old it had lost all color rested in a tiny glass bottle. She lay in the dark and listened to the sounds of the mountain. Wind in the pine trees, a coyote somewhere far off its cry, thin and lonesome. The creak of the cabin settling into cold. And then past midnight, the sound that changed everything she understood about this house. Nettie crying, not loud, not screaming. The soft, helpless crying of a child trapped in a dream she could not escape. Rosalie heard heavy footsteps cross the cabin. Caleb's voice low and rough with sleep, but infinitely gentle. "Papa is here. Papa is here, little bird." But Nettie's voice broke through his comfort like water through a crack. "I want Mama. I want Mama." Silence. Long, heavy, terrible silence. Then Caleb's breathing. One slow exhale that carried the weight of 3 years of sleeping alone of braiding hair. He did not know how to braid, of answering questions he could not answer, of being both father and mother in a house built for 2 adults and coming up short every single day. Rosalie pressed her hand against her mouth in the dark and did not move. Later, when the house had gone quiet again, she heard something else. A sound from outside. Not the wind, not an animal. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, careful. Moving along the front of the cabin, then stopping. Rosalie's breath caught. On the other side of the wall, she heard the soft click of a rifle being cocked. Caleb's bare feet on the floor. The front door opening slowly. "Who is out there?" His voice was flat and hard, the voice of a man who would shoot first if the silence answered wrong. Nothing, just wind. Rosalie did not sleep again. And in the morning, when pale light filled the room and she looked out the window, she saw something that made her stomach tighten. Footprints in the dirt outside the cabin. Boot prints. Not Caleb's, not the old ranch hand Jake's. Someone else had been there in the dark, standing close enough to touch the wall. She watched through the window as Caleb crouched beside the prints, his face unreadable. He stood slowly. He looked toward the tree line. Then he walked to the barn and came back with his rifle, checked the action twice, and carried it with him when he went to work. He did not mention the footprints to Rosalie, but from that morning forward, she noticed he never left the cabin without the rifle within arm's reach. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the small window, and the smell of bacon pulled Rosalie from sleep before she was ready. A soft knock tapped at the door. "Miss Rosalie," Nettie's small voice called. "Papa says breakfast is ready." Rosalie braided her hair quickly and stepped into the main room. Caleb stood at the stove with his back to her, moving with the quiet efficiency of a man who had cooked 10,000 solitary meals. The table was already set, 3 plates, 3 forks, 3 tin cups of coffee, one of which had been diluted with cream for Nettie. "Morning," he said without turning. "Good morning." Nettie swung her legs beneath her chair, grinning. "I brushed Clover today. She is our barn cat. She likes me best." "I am sure she does," Rosalie replied. After breakfast, Caleb reached for his hat. "Jake is riding into town. I will have his send telegrams. We will find this Thomas Redfield and fix the mistake." "Thank you," Rosalie said. She maintained that. But something in her voice caught on the word mistake, as though part of her was no longer sure which part of this situation qualified. When Caleb left, Rosalie looked around the kitchen. The dishes were stacked. The shelves were dusty. The floor had not been properly scrubbed in weeks, maybe months. The cabin was clean the way a man keeps things clean, functional, but neglected in the small details that make a house feel like a home. She could not sit idle. She had never been able to sit idle. Her hands needed work the way her lungs needed air. She washed every dish. She scrubbed the floor on her hands and knees. She found a basket of mending shirts with elbows worn through and began stitching them with thread she found in a small sewing box tucked behind the flour tin. The sewing box had a woman's touch needles organized by size, thread wound neatly, a small pair of silver scissors. Ellen's. Nettie followed her everywhere. She watched Rosalie knead bread dough and asked 14 questions in 3 minutes. She sat perfectly still while Rosalie braided her hair into 2 neat plaits instead of the tangled knots Caleb usually managed. She giggled when Rosalie pretended not to notice flour on her nose. And then in the barn, surrounded by hay dust and the warm smell of horses, Nettie led Rosalie to a quiet corner where 5 tiny kittens tumbled over each other while their mother watched with feline indifference. This one is Snowball, Nettie said proudly, holding up a white kitten with blue eyes. And this one is Patches. And this one does not have a name yet because Papa says 5 cats is already 3 too many. Rosalie knelt beside her, laughing softly. For a brief, suspended moment, she forgot about letters and mistakes and strangers and boot prints in the dark. Then Nettie's voice changed. It dropped low the way a child's voice drops when they are about to say something they have been carrying for a long time. Do you think my mama can see me from heaven? Rosalie's heart went still. She looked at the little girl. Nettie was not looking at her. She was looking at Snowball, stroking the kitten's fur with one small finger. Her face turned slightly away, as though she was afraid of the answer. I believe she can, Rosalie answered gently. Sometimes I cannot remember her voice. Nettie whispered, Is that bad? Rosalie wrapped her arms around the child. The kitten squirmed between them. Hay dust floated in the beams of light coming through the barn slats. No, sweetheart. Love stays even when memories fade. Your mama's love is in everything around you. In this ranch, in your papa, in the way the sun comes through this barn every morning. She is here. She will always be here. Nettie rested her head against Rosalie's shoulder and said nothing for a long time. And in that quiet barn with sunlight spilling through wooden boards and a kitten purring between them, Rosalie felt something she had not expected to feel on this journey. Not fear, not regret, not the sharp ache of being lost. The first small, stubborn spark of belonging. She had been delivered to the wrong ranch. But as Nettie's small hand tightened around hers, Rosalie could not help wondering if perhaps she had not been lost at all. Perhaps the road had known where she needed to go before she did. That night, after Nettie fell asleep clutching Snowball against her nightgown, Rosalie sat by the fire and let the warmth soak into her bones. Caleb sat across from her, whittling a small piece of wood with a folding knife. Neither of them spoke for a long time. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who understood that words cost something and should not be spent carelessly. But Rosalie's mind would not rest. The footprints, Bertie Walsh's story, the name she could not shake. Virgil Doss. She looked at the letters in her suitcase, still folded, still creased from being read too many times. And she wondered for the first time with real fear instead of hope who had really written them. Outside, the Montana wind moved through the tall grass with a sound like breathing. The mountains stood black against the stars, and somewhere in the darkness beyond the firelight, something shifted. A horse, tied behind the barn, where no horse should be. But Rosalie did not hear it, and Caleb, for all his vigilance, did not check. Not tonight. By morning, whoever had been there was gone. Only the hoof prints remained pressed deep into the soft earth beside the fence pointing back toward Cedar Ridge. Someone was watching Whispering Creek Ranch, and they were getting closer. 3 weeks passed at Whispering Creek Ranch, and each one peeled back a layer of the life Rosalie Bennett had planned until there was nothing left underneath but the raw, uncertain truth of where she actually stood. She had expected answers by now. She had expected a telegram to arrive with directions to Sunrise Valley Ranch, with an apology for the confusion, with the voice of Thomas Redfield reaching across the wire to say he was real and he was waiting. She had expected to leave. Instead, she learned the rhythms of a house that was not hers. She learned that Caleb took his coffee black before dawn and did not speak until his second cup. She learned that Jake Pruitt, the old ranch hand who had worked this land since before Caleb was born, communicated mostly through nods and grunts and the occasional sentence that arrived fully formed, like something he had been composing in his head for hours. She learned that Nettie woke with the sun and fell asleep mid-sentence at the dinner table, her small body surrendering to exhaustion with the sudden totality that only children possess. She learned where the flour was kept and which pot had a loose handle. She learned that the chestnut mare named Daisy would eat apple slices from a flat palm, but spooked at loud voices. She learned that the barn cat Clover slept in Nettie's bed more nights than not, and that Caleb pretended not to notice. She learned these things the way a person learns the geography of a place they are passing through. Carefully, attentively, without allowing herself to believe she would stay. But the days kept coming, and the answers did not. Jake rode into Cedar Ridge every few days, each time carrying a new set of telegrams to send and returning with the same answer. Nothing. No record of a Thomas Redfield in the territory. No Sunrise Valley Ranch registered with any land office. No forwarding address, no business license, no tax filing, no trace of a man who had written 3 detailed letters about a life that apparently existed only on paper. The afternoon Jake returned with the final word. The air in the cabin changed. He came through the door slowly removing his hat, the way men do when they are about to deliver news that cannot be softened. His face always weathered and still carried something heavier than usual. He looked at Caleb first, then at Rosalie, then at the floor. I asked everywhere, he said. Telegraph office, post office, land registry. I sent wires to Cedar Ridge, to Helena, to every settlement within 200 miles. Nobody has heard of Thomas Redfield. There is no ranch called Sunrise Valley anywhere in this territory. Rosalie felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. Not physically, but somewhere inside her, the ground she had built her courage on shifted and cracked. That cannot be right, she whispered. I have letters, 3 letters, with details. The name of the ranch, the description of the land, the distance from Cedar Ridge. Jake shifted his weight from one boot to the other. He was not a man who enjoyed delivering pain, but he was also not a man who would dress it up in comfortable lies. Could be a false name. It happens more than folks like to admit. Men place advertisements they never intend to honor. They write letters using names that do not belong to them. He paused, and then he added the piece of information that would change the shape of everything Rosalie thought she understood. There is something else. While I was in town, I heard talk about a man named Virgil Doss. He was arrested in Wyoming territory about 2 months back. Ran a scheme targeting women through mail-order bride advertisements. Used different names in different territories. Drew women out to remote places where they had no resources and no way home. The name hit Rosalie like a stone dropped into still water. Virgil Doss, the same name Bertie Walsh had spoken in the kitchen of that trading post, her hands steady, her voice shaking. Several of his victims have come forward, Jake continued. The authorities are still piecing together how many women he contacted. They say he used at least 6 different names. Rosalie opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Her fingers gripped the edge of the table until her knuckles turned white. Caleb had been standing near the window listening without interruption. Now he spoke, his voice low and measured. You think this Virgil Doss and Thomas Redfield are the same man? Jake met his eyes. I think it is worth considering. The silence that followed was the kind that fills a room the way water fills a sinking boat, slowly, steadily, and with the certainty that nothing will be the same once it reaches the top. Rosalie pushed back from the table and walked outside. The prairie stretched wan and endless before her, golden grass bending under a wind that carried the first cold edge of approaching winter. The mountains stood in the distance, impassive and enormous, offering no comfort and no judgment. They had been there before she arrived. They would be there long after she was gone. She had crossed half a country. She had sold everything she owned. She had said goodbye to her parents' graves and climbed into a stagecoach and ridden for 5 days through storms and broken axles and sleepless nights, all for a man who might never have existed. All for a name written by a hand that had written the same promises to 6 other women, or 7 or more. She heard the cabin door open behind her, Caleb's boots on the porch. Then nothing. He stopped a few paces away, close enough to be present, far enough to give her room. The instinct of a man who understood that some pain needed space before it needed company. I am sorry, he said quietly. She did not turn around. I thought I was careful. I thought I was sensible. You were brave. She laughed, but the sound had no joy in it. A dry, bitter exhalation that the wind carried away before it could land. Brave women do not arrive at the wrong ranch with $3 and a broken promise. Brave women do not give up either. She turned then. He stood squinting slightly against the low sun, one thumb hooked in his belt, and his face held no pity. That was the thing she noticed. Other people's faces when they looked at Rosalie Bennett always carried pity. The shopkeeper's wife, Mrs. Pemberton, the women at church, even Bertie Walsh. All of them looked at her and saw someone to feel sorry for. Caleb did not. He looked at her the way he looked at a fence that needed mending or a storm rolling in from the west. With attention, with respect for the difficulty, and with the quiet assumption that it could be handled. You can stay, he said. She blinked. What? You have done more good in this house in 3 weeks than I have managed in 3 years. Nettie laughs again. She sleeps without waking in the night. She talks about you from sunrise to sunset. He paused and something moved behind his eyes, something he was not accustomed to saying. And you, Tom? Rosalie asked. The question hung between them. Caleb looked at the mountains, then at the ground, then back at her. I forgot what it felt like to share a meal without sitting in silence. The fire crackled softly inside the cabin. Outside, the wind moved through the cottonwood trees, carrying the scent of grass and the promise of frost. And Rosalie felt something shift inside her. Something steady and slow, like a river, finding a new course. She did not say yes. She did not say no. She said, let me think about it. And Caleb nodded because he was the kind of man who understood that some answers needed time to grow before they could be spoken. That night, after Nettie had been tucked in and the lamp burned low, Rosalie sat alone at the small table and unfolded the 3 letters one final time. She studied the careful handwriting. She searched for clues she might have missed. A smudge, a hesitation in the pen stroke, a word chosen too deliberately the way a liar chooses words not for meaning, but for effect. And she found it. Or rather, she found the absence of it. In 3 letters, Thomas Redfield had never once mentioned a personal detail about himself. Not his age, not his appearance, not how long he had lived in Montana, not a single memory or preference or habit. He had described a ranch. He had described what he needed in a wife, but he had never described himself, because there was no self to describe. There was only a name, a mask, a trap made of ink and paper designed to catch women who had nowhere else to turn. Rosalie folded the letters neatly, placed them back in her suitcase, and closed the lid. Then she sat in the quiet cabin and stared at the fire until the coals went dark. The following morning, the thing that had been circling Whispering Creek Ranch in the dark finally showed itself in the daylight. Not literally, not yet. But Jake returned from another trip to Cedar Ridge with 2 pieces of news, and neither of them was good. The first was confirmation. The telegraph office had received a reply from the U.S. Marshal's office in Cheyenne. Virgil Doss had indeed operated under multiple aliases. One of the names recovered from his belongings when he was arrested was Thomas Redfield. The handwriting on the seized letters matched the handwriting in advertisements placed in newspapers across Missouri, Kansas, and Nebraska. Rosalie was not the first, and if Doss had not been caught, she would not have been the last. The second piece of news was closer to home. The whole town is talking, Jake said, his voice careful and flat, about you being here, about Caleb having a young woman under his roof. While Caleb, who had been mending a bridle at the table, did not look up. People talk. That is what people do. This is different, Jake said. He removed his hat and held it in both hands, a gesture Rosalie had come to recognize as his version of raising an alarm. Margaret Caldwell is behind it. She has been speaking to women at the church. She has been speaking to the shopkeepers. She's been telling anyone who will listen that your reputation is at risk and the child is in an improper environment. Rosalie had heard the name Margaret Caldwell mentioned once before by Jake in passing. She was a widow, the owner of the largest general store in Cedar Ridge, a woman of means and influence, whose late husband had left her with enough money to buy respectability and enough ambition to weaponize it. Caleb's hands stopped moving on the bridle. He did not look up, but his stillness was different now. The stillness of a man whose attention had shifted entirely. Margaret Caldwell has wanted this ranch for 3 years, he said quietly. She has wanted me to need her. She has sent food I did not ask for. She has offered to take Nettie on weekends I did not request. She has made it clear to everyone in Cedar Ridge that she considers herself the obvious solution to my situation. He looked at Rosalie then. I have refused her every time, and Margaret Caldwell is not a woman who forgives being refused. This was the moment Rosalie understood that the danger at Whispering Creek Ranch was not only about a con man in a Wyoming jail cell. It was about a woman in a cedar-shingled store in the nearest town, a woman with power and patience and a grudge who had just been handed the perfect weapon. A young woman with no family, no reputation, and no legal standing, living under the roof of the man Margaret wanted for herself. Days passed and the tension grew the way weather grows on the plains, invisible at first, then impossible to ignore. Rosalie continued to work. She rose before dawn and baked bread and mended clothes and organized shelves that had not been touched since Ellen Henshaw died. She did it not because she was asked, but because her hands demanded purpose, and because the house responded to her care the way a garden responds to rain. Things that had been neglected came back to life. Things that had been broken were repaired. Things that had been silent began to make sound again. Nettie continued to follow her like a shadow made of giggles and questions. Rosalie taught her to knead dough properly, pressing with the heels of her palms instead of her fingers. She taught her to stitch a straight seam. She wove wildflowers into the girl's braids and told her stories before bed stories. Rosalie's own mother had told her about clever foxes and stubborn mules, and a girl who walked so far west, she found the edge of the world and decided to keep going. And every night Nettie fell asleep faster. The nightmares that had plagued her for 3 years, the ones that sent her crying into the dark, calling for a mother who could not answer, grew quieter and less frequent. Not gone, but fading, the way pain fades when something warm is placed beside it. Caleb watched all of this in silence. He was a man who observed more than he spoke, who cataloged the world through his eyes rather than his mouth. And what he saw was something he had stopped believing was possible. His house was becoming a home again. One afternoon, Rosalie stood at the wash line pinning damp shirts to the rope when Caleb walked over from the barn. He stopped a few feet away, hands in his pockets, looking at her with an expression she could not quite read. "You do not have to do all this," he said. She did not look at him. "I would feel useless if I did nothing." "You are not useless." 3 words, simple as fence posts. But they landed inside Rosalie with a warmth that had nothing to do with the Montana sun overhead. She paused with a clothespin in her hand and looked at him. He looked back, and for a moment the distance between them felt less like a boundary and more like a bridge that neither of them had the courage to cross. Not yet. Then Nettie's voice shattered the moment with the glorious obliviousness of childhood. "Papa, Miss Rosalie Snowball climbed up on the roof and she will not come down." They both turned. Caleb sighed. Rosalie pressed her lips together to keep from laughing. And the moment passed, but it left something behind. A warmth that lingered. A possibility that neither of them named. The week before the county fair, something happened that Rosalie had been both dreading and longing for in equal measure. She was in the kitchen, kneading dough for the 3rd time that morning because Nettie had requested biscuits, and Nettie's requests had become very difficult to refuse. The kitchen was warm with the heat of the stove. Flour dusted the table. A kettle whistled on the back burner. The front door slammed open, and Nettie ran in at full speed, Boots' muddy face bright with the emergency of the moment. "Mama, Mama Snowball caught a mouse, a real one. Come see." The word detonated in the silence like a crack of thunder. "Mama." Both of them froze. Nettie first, her mouth open, her eyes going wide with the sudden realization of what she had said. Then Rosalie, her hands still buried in dough, her heart stopping and starting in her chest like a clock knocked off a shelf. Nettie covered her mouth with both hands, her eyes filled with tears, not of sadness, but of fear. The fear of a child who has done something she cannot take back. "I am sorry," she whispered through her fingers. "I did not mean to. It just came out." Rosalie knelt on the kitchen floor. She took Nettie's small, dirty hands in her own flour-covered ones and held them gently. "You have nothing to be sorry for, sweetheart. Nothing at all. But you are not my mama." "No," Rosalie said softly. "But that does not mean what you feel is wrong." Nettie stared at her with those enormous brown eyes searching for permission to feel what she was already feeling. And Rosalie gave it to her, not with grand words, just with steady hands and a gaze that did not waver. But that evening, after Nettie had been washed and fed and tucked into bed with Snowball curled against her chest, Caleb sat across from Rosalie at the table and spoke in a voice stretched tight as wire. "She is attaching to you, deeply." Rosalie set down her coffee cup. "I know. If you leave, she will lose a mother for the 2nd time." The words fell between them like stones into a well. "I know that too," Rosalie said quietly. Caleb leaned forward, and for the first time she saw something in his face that was not composure or strength or quiet authority. She saw fear. The raw, cornered fear of a man who had already lost the most important person in his life and could not survive watching his daughter lose that same thing again. "I cannot let that happen," he said. "Not again." Rosalie understood then that his words were not an accusation. They were a confession. He was not pushing her away because he did not need her. He was pushing her away because he was terrified of how much he already did. She could have argued. She could have reassured him. Instead, she said the only thing that mattered. I did not come here by choice, Caleb, but I am choosing to be here now. Do not make that decision for me. He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded once the way he nodded at everything and looked away. But something between them had shifted. A wall had cracked, not fallen, not yet, but cracked enough to let the light through. The next afternoon, while they were mending the fence along the east pasture, working side by side in the kind of companionable silence that only exists between people who have stopped needing to fill every pause with words, Caleb spoke without warning. As though the words had been sitting inside him for so long, they had finally reached the surface on their own without his permission. Ellen, my wife, she got sick during our last winter together. Rosalie's hand stopped on the wire she was holding. She did not look at him. She knew instinctively that if she turned, he might stop talking. Cough that would not quit. Fever that came and went and came back worse each time. I told her it would pass. I told her the cold would break and I would take her into town to see the doctor. He drove a fence post into the ground with 3 hard strikes of the mallet, each blow precise, each blow carrying something that was not about the post at all. But the snow kept coming. The passes closed. The trail to Cedar Ridge was buried under 4 feet of ice and drift. I could not get the wagon through. I could not even get a horse through. He stopped hammering. He stood with both hands on the mallet, looking at the mountains as though they owed him something. I should have gone sooner, before the storm, before the passes closed. I knew she was sick. I knew it was getting worse. But the cattle needed feeding. The fences needed repair. The ranch needed me. His voice cracked, not dramatically, not the way voices crack in stories told for entertainment. It cracked the way wood cracks under too much weight, with a sound so small you might miss it unless you were listening very carefully. By the time the snow melted enough to ride, it was too late. The doctor said if I had brought her in 2 weeks earlier, she might have made it. 2 weeks. That is what her life cost. 14 days I spent feeding cattle and nailing boards while my wife died in our bed. Caleb's instructions were always the same when he rode out. Stay with Nettie, keep the door bolted. Do not leave the house. She had obeyed every time. Until today. Because today, from the porch, she heard something Caleb could not hear from half a mile away. A high, panicked bleating from the gully beyond the south pasture. Not cattle, a calf, young and frightened and separated from its mother. Nettie appeared at the door. Is that Buttercup's baby? Rosalie hesitated. She looked toward the tree line where Caleb and Jake had vanished. She looked toward the gully. The bleating grew more frantic. She pulled on her boots. Stay inside, Nettie. Bolt the door. Do not open it for anyone except me or your papa. Nettie's eyes went wide, but she nodded. She was the daughter of a mountain man. She knew how to follow instructions that mattered. Rosalie ran to the barn and saddled Daisy, the gentle chestnut mare. She had watched Caleb saddle horses a dozen times. She was not fast, but she was thorough. She checked the cinch twice the way she had seen Jake do, then swung herself up and rode hard toward the gully. Wind whipped her hair loose from its braid. Dust rose around her like smoke. The Montana landscape blurred past in shades of gold and brown, and beneath her Daisy moved with the sure-footed confidence of a horse that knew this land better than any map. She found the calf near the edge of a dry creek bed. It was young, maybe 2 weeks old, standing on a narrow ledge where the bank had partially collapsed. Below it, a drop of perhaps 10 feet into a rocky channel. Above it, loose dirt and crumbling grass. The calf was too frightened to move forward and too stupid to back up. Rosalie dismounted and approached slowly, murmuring the way she had watched Caleb talk to frightened animals. Low, steady, rhythmic, like a heartbeat made into words. Easy, little one, easy. Nobody is going to hurt you. Just stay still. She reached out her hand. The calf stamped but did not bolt. She took another step. The ledge held. She took another. Her fingers brushed the calf's flank. And then the ground moved. Not an earthquake. Worse. The slow, irreversible collapse of dry earth that had been waiting for the wrong amount of weight in the wrong place. The bank beneath her left foot crumbled like sugar. Her body pitched forward. She grabbed at the grass and it tore free in her fist. She was sliding feet first toward the rocky drop. Then a hand seized her arm. Not gently, not politely, with the desperate, crushing strength of a man who had just watched someone he cared about begin to fall. I have got you, Caleb. On horseback above her, leaning so far out of the saddle that his own balance was gone, holding her arm with both hands while his horse braced against the pole. For one breathless, terrible moment, they were both suspended. Rosalie's boots dangled over the edge. Caleb's body strained against gravity. The horse snorted and stamped. Then he pulled. One massive, wrenching effort that dragged her up and over the lip of the bank. They tumbled backward together into the dust, landing in a heap of limbs and leather and racing heartbeats. Rosalie lay on her back, staring up at the Montana sky. Caleb lay beside her, breathing hard, his hat gone, his face covered in dirt. Neither of them moved for several seconds. You could have been killed, he said. There was anger in his voice, but it was born from fear or not hostility. The anger of a man who has already lost too much and cannot bear to lose again. So could you, she answered. He turned his head and looked at her. Dirt on his face, sweat on his brow, eyes burning with something he could not name and she could not ignore. You are the most stubborn woman I have ever met, and you are the most stubborn man. Something almost like a smile crossed his face. Almost. Then it was gone, replaced by the careful blankness he wore like armor. But Rosalie had seen it, and she would not forget. When they rode back to the ranch, Nettie burst through the front door before the horses had stopped. Tears streaked her dusty cheeks. She had been watching from the window, Rosalie realized. She had seen everything. Papa. Miss Rosalie, are you hurt? Caleb swung down and knelt to gather her. We are fine, little bird. But Nettie turned from her father and threw her arms around Rosalie's waist with the fierce, desperate strength of a child who has already learned what it means to lose someone. I prayed, she said, her voice muffled against Rosalie's dress. I asked God to keep my mama safe. The word hung in the air like a bell still ringing. Mama. This time it was not an accident. This time it was not a slip of the tongue. Anna, Caleb's hand stopped. She told the judge that if you do not, and I am quoting her words, stabilize your domestic situation, she is prepared to offer herself as a suitable guardian for Nettie. For the child's well-being, she says. The silence lasted 3 full breaths. Then Caleb spoke, and his voice was something Rosalie had never heard before. Not loud, not raised, but cold in a way that the Montana winter had nothing on. The cold of bedrock, the cold of a man who had drawn a line in the dirt and would die on it. Nobody takes my daughter. Jake nodded slowly. The judge has set a hearing at the county fair 3 weeks from now. Margaret wants it public. She wants the community there. Rosalie felt the ground shift beneath her again, but this time instead of falling, she felt something rise. Not anger, though that was part of it. Something more foundational. The realization that her presence here was no longer just a personal question of where she belonged. It was a weapon being used against the man who had taken her in and the child who had called her mama. I should leave, she said that night after Nettie was asleep. If I go, Margaret has no basis for her claim. The improper environment argument disappears. Caleb looked at her across the table. The lamp between them flickered, casting shadows that moved like living things. If you leave, Nettie loses you. She has already called you mama. She has already decided you are hers. If you walk away now, I will spend the next year listening to her cry for someone who left by choice. He paused. And I have already lost enough. The words were not romantic. They were not poetic. They were the words of a man standing at the edge of a cliff, looking down and admitting that the fall terrified him more than the fight. There is one way Margaret cannot win, he said. One way nobody can claim Nettie is in an improper home. Rosalie looked at him. The fire crackled. The wind pressed against the windows. If you stay, not as a guest, not as help, as my wife. The word wife landed in the room like a stone landing in still water. Ripples moved outward in every direction, touching everything. This was not a love confession. Rosalie knew that. This was a tactical proposal from a practical man facing a practical threat. He was offering a solution, not a sentiment, but his eyes. Something in his eyes told a different story. Something he probably did not know he was revealing. A hope so fragile it looked like it might shatter if she said the wrong thing. "I need time," she said. He nodded. "The fair is in 3 weeks. Margaret will make her move there. Then I will give you my answer before then." Caleb stood. He ran a hand through his hair and looked at her one more time, and in that look was everything he could not say. 3 years of silence. 3 years of eating alone. 3 years of watching his daughter grow up without the one thing he could not provide, no matter how hard he worked or how many fences he mended. Then he walked to his room and closed the door, and Rosalie sat alone in the lamplight with a question that had no safe answer. Stay and risk becoming a weapon used against the people she loved, or leave and break the heart of a child who had already been broken once. 3 weeks. The fair was in 3 weeks. And somewhere in the space between those weeks, Rosalie Bennett would have to decide whether the wrong ranch could become the right home, whether a proposal born from necessity could grow into something real, whether a mountain man's cracked and guarded heart had room for one more person inside it. She stared into the fire until the last ember went dark, and outside in the cold Montana night, the wind carried the sound of hoofbeats fading toward Cedar Ridge. Jake had already discovered the truth about the boot prints. They belonged to a hired man, Margaret's hired man, someone she had been sending to the ranch for weeks, watching, waiting, gathering evidence for the case she intended to bring before the judge in the town. The predator had been patient, but now she was ready to strike, and the clock was ticking. 2 days before the county fair, Rosalie found the letter that changed everything. She had not been looking for it. She had not been looking for anything at all. She was cleaning the way she always cleaned, with the steady, purposeful rhythm of a woman who had learned that busy hands kept a worried mind from eating itself alive. The shelves in the small guest room, her room now, though she still could not bring herself to call it, that had accumulated a thin layer of dust behind the books. A Bible with a cracked spine, a volume of hymns, a small leather-bound journal with blank pages that had never been written in. She pulled the Bible out to wipe the shelf behind it, and the book slipped from her hand. It struck the floor spine first and fell open, and from between the pages of Psalms, a folded sheet of paper drifted down like a leaf released from a branch that had been holding it for a very long time. Rosalie picked it up. The paper was thin, fragile at the edges. The handwriting was feminine, careful but unsteady. The letters formed with effort, as though the hand that held the pen had been shaking. Or weak, or both. She knew she should not read it. The letter was not addressed to her. It was not meant for her eyes. It belonged to the woman who had hung the lace curtains and chosen the chipped teacup and placed the photograph face down on the shelf. But her eyes found the first line before her conscience could intervene, and once she began, she could not stop. "My dearest Caleb, when I write these words, I know that I will not be with you when the snow melts. I can feel it the way you feel weather coming, not in the mind but in the body, in the bones, in the quiet certainty that arrives before the storm does. Do not blame yourself. I know you will. I know you are already doing it, even as you sit beside me and hold my hand and pretend that everything will be fine. I can see it in your face. I can see you counting the days since the pass is closed, adding them up like a debt you believe you owe. The snow is not your fault. The distance is not your fault. You did not choose for the winter to come early or for the road to disappear. You chose to build a life on this land, and I chose to build it with you. And every morning I woke up in this cabin was a morning I would not trade for a mansion in St. Louis. But I need to tell you something, Caleb, and I need you to hear it, even if you cannot hear it now. Even if you read this letter a year from now, or 5 years from now, or never, I need you to know. I am not afraid of leaving. I am afraid of what you will become after I am gone. I am afraid you will lock the door of your heart and throw away the key and spend the rest of your life punishing yourself for something that was never in your control. I am afraid you will raise our Nettie alone, not because you have to, but because you believe you do not deserve help. I am afraid she will grow up without someone to braid her hair and sing to her at night and hold her when she cries for me. Because she will cry for me, Caleb. She will cry and you will not know what to say, and it will break you. And I cannot bear the thought of that. So I am asking you one thing that is harder than any fence you have ever mended or any winter you have ever survived. Let someone in. Open the door. Nettie needs a mother, not a replacement for me. Nobody can be that. But someone new. Someone who will love her the way she deserves to be loved, which is completely without reservation, without looking over her shoulder at a ghost. And you, Caleb, you deserve to be loved again. You deserve to sit at that table and hear a voice that is not your own. You deserve to grow old with someone beside you. Please do not let the grief win. I love you. I have loved you since the day you came into that trading post with mud on your boots and sawdust in your hair and asked me if I knew anything about raising cattle. I said no, and you said neither do I, and we both laughed, and that was the beginning of everything good in my life. Let there be another beginning. For you, for Nettie, for whatever comes next. Your Ellen. Rosalie folded the letter with trembling hands. She folded it along the same creases, matching the edges exactly, as though by preserving the physical form she could contain the enormity of what she had just read. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed and pressed both hands against her mouth. The room was silent. The afternoon light slanted through the window, warm and golden, and dust motes drifted in the beam like tiny, weightless worlds. Ellen Henshaw had known she was dying. She had known her husband would blame himself. She had known her daughter would grow up reaching for a hand that was no longer there. And in the last days of her life, with a pen that could barely hold steady, she had written not a farewell, but a permission. Open the door. Rosalie was not Ellen's replacement. She had known that from the beginning. You cannot replace a woman any more than you can replace a season. Spring is not a replacement for winter. It is what comes after. But she was beginning to understand something she had not understood before. She was not here by accident. No mystical force had guided the stagecoach to the wrong address. She was here because a con man wrote a letter and a stage driver read a manifest and a wheel turned left instead of right. But she was staying because a little girl needed someone to braid her hair, because a man needed someone to sit across from him at the table, because a dead woman had written a letter asking the universe to send exactly the kind of person Rosalie was trying to become. She placed the letter back inside the Bible. She closed the cover gently. She set it on the shelf, and then she went to find Caleb. He was in the barn doing what he always did when the world pressed too hard, working. His back was to the door. He was stacking hay bales with the mechanical precision of a man who had decided that if he stopped moving, the thoughts would catch up with him. Caleb, he turned, saw her face, set down the bale. What is wrong? Nothing is wrong. She paused. I found something. In the Bible on the shelf, Ellen's Bible. His body went still. Rosalie stood in the barn doorway and watched the light move across the hay while Caleb read his dead wife's last words. She did not watch his face. She gave him that privacy. But she heard his breathing change. She heard the paper crinkle as his hands tightened. She heard one sharp intake of breath that sounded like something breaking and something opening at the same time. When he finished, he folded the letter with the same care she had used. He held it against his chest for a long moment, both hands pressed flat over his heart. His jaw worked. His eyes were bright, but he did not cry. Mountain men did not cry, or at least that is what they told themselves. But his hands shook with the effort of holding everything in. She wanted me to open the door, he said. She wanted Nettie to have a mother, Rosalie replied, and she wanted you to let yourself be loved again. He looked up at her. I asked you before to stay as my wife, he said. I asked because it was the practical thing to do, because Margaret Caldwell was threatening to take my daughter, and marriage was the simplest way to stop her. He looked at her. I am asking again, but not because of Margaret, not because of the judge, not because it is practical. He took a step toward her, one step, closing a distance that was measured in more than feet. I am asking because I want you here, because this house has not felt like a home in 3 years, and you walked through the door and it started breathing again. Because my daughter called you Mama, and I did not correct her because she was right. His voice was not smooth. It was not rehearsed. It was the voice of a man who had spent 3 years in silence and was now pulling words up from somewhere deep, one at a time, like drawing water from a well he had thought was dry. Stay as my wife, Rosalie, not because you have to, because I am asking. She looked at him. This rough, quiet, weathered man who had pulled her from the edge of a crumbling bank and carried his daughter to bed each night and cooked 10,000 meals in silence, and never once complained about the weight he carried. This man who had turned a photograph face down because looking at it hurt too much and who had never opened his wife's Bible because the grief was still too close. This man who was standing in a barn with hay in his hair and his hat in his hands, asking a woman who had arrived at the wrong ranch to please not leave. Yes, she said. The word was small, one syllable, 3 letters, but it felt like stepping into sunlight after a very long winter. Caleb let out a breath. A slow, trembling exhale that he had been holding, she realized, not just since he asked the question, but for weeks, maybe months, maybe since the moment she had knelt on his kitchen floor and told his daughter that there was nothing to be sorry for. He reached for her hand, and this time she did not hesitate. But the peace that followed lasted exactly 3 days. On a cold Wednesday afternoon, while Caleb was checking the fence line along the North Ridge and Rosalie was teaching Nettie how to roll pie crust, the sound of wheels on the dirt road brought both of them to the window. A black carriage, not a wagon. A carriage polished and proper, the kind that belonged to someone who wanted the world to know they could afford one. Margaret Caldwell stepped down first. Her dark dress was pressed. Her gloves were clean. Her face carried the composed, righteous expression of a woman who believed she was doing God's work and would not hear otherwise. Behind her came Judge Harlan Briggs, thin and spectacled, clutching a leather folder. And behind him, 2 men Rosalie did not recognize, standing with the practiced stillness of hired muscle disguised as escorts. Margaret did not knock. "I am here for the child," she said, her voice carrying across the yard with the clarity of someone who had rehearsed the line. "The judge has signed a preliminary review order." Inside, Nettie's hands went still on the rolling pin. Her eyes went wide. Then her face crumpled, and the sound that came from her was not a child's cry, but something older and deeper, the sound of a girl who had already lost one mother and understood with terrible clarity that she was about to lose another. Rosalie heard Caleb before she saw him, hoofbeats coming fast from the ridge. He must have seen the carriage from the high ground. He rode into the yard at a gallop, swung down before the horse had fully stopped, and crossed the distance to the porch in 4 long strides. He did not reach for a weapon. He did not shout. He stood in the doorway and filled it with his body hands, gripping the frame on either side. "Nobody steps through this door." Margaret smiled. The patient, practiced smile of a woman holding what she believed was an unbeatable hand. "Mr. Henshaw, this is not a matter of force. This is a legal proceeding. Judge Briggs has the authority to inspect the child's living conditions. He can inspect from the yard." Judge Briggs cleared his throat. "Mr. Henshaw, I understand this is difficult. I am not here to remove the child today. I am here to assess the situation and determine whether a formal hearing is warranted." Margaret leaned forward slightly and said loud enough for Rosalie to hear through the open window, "This woman arrived through a confident scheme. She has no family, no legal standing, no connection to this child whatsoever. She is a stranger, Mr. Briggs, a stranger living in a house with a minor." Then she added with a cruelty so precise it could only have been premeditated, "Caleb Henshaw let his wife die while he tended cattle. They taught me to stand on my own feet and to recognize a person who uses goodness as a mask for greed." Margaret's smile faltered. "You say this child needs stability. I have braided her hair every morning for 6 weeks. I have cooked her meals. I have told her stories at bedtime. I have held her in the dark and she cried for a mother who cannot come back. I have done these things not because anyone asked me to, but because she needed them. And I have never not once seen you set foot on this ranch to do the same." The yard was silent. The wind moved through the grass. Judge Briggs looked at Rosalie over his spectacles with an expression that was no longer discomfort, but something closer to attention. Margaret recovered, but slower this time. "The hearing will determine the facts, Miss Bennett. I will see you at the county fair." She turned and climbed back into her carriage. The judge followed, his folder still unopened. The 2 hired men mounted up without a word. As the carriage rolled away, Caleb stepped onto the porch beside Rosalie. He did not speak. He stood close enough that his shoulder nearly touched hers, and they watched the dust settle on the road together. From inside, a small voice called, trembling but defiant, "Mama, are they gone?" Rosalie turned back to the doorway where Nettie stood, flour still on her hands, tears still on her cheeks, and something in her eyes that was not fear, but the fierce, stubborn hope of a child who refuses to let go. "They are gone, sweetheart. Come finish your pie. Nettie ran to her and buried her face in Rosalie's apron, and Rosalie held her and looked at Caleb over the child's head, and in that look was a conversation that needed no words. We fight. Together. No matter what. The fair was in 3 days. Rosalie sat beside him in a blue dress, simple but clean, her hair braided and pinned. Nettie bounced in the back, clutching her basket of ribbons and wildflowers like treasure. People turned to look as they passed. Some smiled, some nodded. Many whispered. A widower bringing a young woman to the county fair would always stir talk in a town this small. Rosalie felt the weight of their eyes the way she had felt the weight of eyes in Barton, Missouri. The assessment, the judgment, the curiosity wrapped in politeness. But she did not shrink. She kept her chin high and her back straight and her hands still in her lap. She had spent 24 years making herself smaller to fit other people's expectations. She would not do it again. At the fairgrounds, Nettie ran immediately to the children's table and began laying out her stitched ribbons with the careful precision of a museum curator. Each one was placed just so smoothed flat, adjusted for symmetry. Miss Rosalie helped me, she told anyone who came near. The baker's wife, the school teacher, the farrier's daughter. Every person who paused received the same announcement delivered with pride, so pure it was almost blinding. Rosalie stood behind her, steady and close, present. Margaret Caldwell arrived at noon. She came in a carriage, not a wagon, wearing a dress that cost more than most families in Cedar Ridge earned in a month. Her hair was pinned beneath a hat trimmed with ribbon. Her gloves were clean. Her posture was perfect. She looked as she always looked, like the most respectable woman within 50 miles. She was accompanied by Judge Harlan Briggs, a thin man in his 60s with spectacles and a permanent expression of mild discomfort, as though the world continually failed to meet his standards for order. Behind them walked 2 men Rosalie did not recognize, broad-shouldered and silent, present for show rather than substance. Margaret surveyed the fairgrounds the way a general surveys a battlefield. Her eyes found Caleb first, then Rosalie, then Nettie. She smiled. The smile of a woman who had already counted her pieces and believed the game was won. She approached Rosalie while Caleb was fetching water. "Miss Bennett," Margaret said warmly, the warmth of a January sun that gives light without heat. "How lovely to see you here. I do hope you have given thought to your future. This situation cannot continue indefinitely, you understand." "I understand more than you might expect, Mrs. Caldwell." "The judge is here today," Margaret continued, lowering her voice to the confidential register she used when delivering threats. "He will be addressing the matter of the child's welfare this afternoon. I want you to know that I hold no personal animosity toward you. This is about Nettie, about what is best for her." "If you believe that," Rosalie said quietly, "you would not have sent a man to spy on us in the middle of the night." Margaret's smile flickered, a crack in the porcelain. "Just for a moment. I do not know what you are referring to." "Boot prints, Mrs. Caldwell, outside the cabin. Your hired man was not as careful as you thought." Margaret recovered quickly. The smile returned smooth and practiced. "A concerned citizen has every right to observe a troubling situation." The judge agreed. "The judge will hear from us too," Rosalie said, "and he will hear the truth." Margaret leaned closer. Her perfume was heavy and sweet, the scent of money and control. "The truth, Miss Bennett, is that you arrived here through a confidence scheme. You have no family, no standing, no legal connection to that child. You are a stranger who was deposited on a doorstep by a stagecoach and decided to stay. The judge will see that clearly." Rosalie held her gaze. She did not blink. She did not step back. "Then the judge will also see a child who laughs again, who sleeps through the night, who calls me mama not because anyone told her to, but because her heart chose it. And he will see a woman who stands in her own name, Mrs. Caldwell. Rosalie Bennett, daughter of William and Mary Bennett of Barton, Missouri. I may not have money, I may not have land, but I have a name, and I have the truth, and I have 2 hands that have done more for that child in 6 weeks than yours have done in 3 years." Margaret's eyes hardened. The mask slipped for just a moment, and behind it Rosalie saw what she had suspected all along. Not concern for Nettie, not moral outrage. Hunger, the raw, acquisitive hunger of a woman who wanted something that was not hers and was prepared to use a child as a lever to get it. You will regret this, Margaret said softly. Perhaps, but that is my choice to make. Margaret turned and walked away, her heels striking the packed earth with the precise rhythm of a clock counting down. The afternoon wore on. Fiddle music played. Children competed in sack races. The smell of roasted corn and apple cider mixed with dust and autumn air. And at 2 o'clock, when the shadow of the church steeple had crossed the center of Main Street, Judge Harlan Briggs took his seat behind a table near the bandstand and called for order. The hearing was not a trial. Cedar Ridge had no courthouse, and Judge Briggs had no gavel. But the weight of the proceedings was real. A dozen families had gathered, drawn by curiosity or concern or the irresistible human need to witness moments where lives hang in the balance. Margaret spoke first. She was composed, articulate, and devastating. She described a young woman of unknown origin, arrived through a fraudulent scheme, living unchaperoned, in the home of an unmarried man with a minor child. She expressed her deep concern for Nettie's moral development and physical safety. She offered herself as a stable God-fearing alternative. A woman of means and reputation. A woman the community trusted. She was good. Rosalie would give her that. Every word was chosen. Every pause was calculated. She painted a picture that from the outside looked righteous. Judge Briggs listened with his spectacles perched on the end of his nose, his pen moving in small, careful notes. Then it was Caleb's turn. He stood slowly. He was not a man built for public speaking. His hands hung at his sides like they belonged somewhere else, on a hammer, on reins, on the warm neck of a horse. He looked at the judge, then at the faces of his neighbors, then at the ground. "I do not have a speech," he said. "I am not a man who talks well in front of people. I am a man who works land and raises cattle and takes care of his daughter the best way I know how." He paused. The wind moved through the fairgrounds, carrying the faint sound of a child laughing somewhere behind the livestock pens. "My wife died 3 years ago. Since then, I have done everything alone. I have cooked every meal. I have mended every dress. I have tried to braid hair I do not know how to braid. I have held my daughter in the middle of the night while she cried for a mother who cannot come back." His voice was steady, but there was a crack beneath it, the kind of crack that only forms under sustained, relentless pressure. "Miss Bennett arrived at my ranch by mistake. That is true. She was delivered to the wrong address by a stagecoach company that read a manifest wrong. She had no money to leave and no place to go. I let her stay because it was the right thing to do. Because my mother raised me to help people who are stranded, not to leave them standing in the dust." He looked at Rosalie. "What I did not expect is what happened after. My daughter started laughing again. She started sleeping through the night. She stopped waking up screaming for her mama because someone was there. Someone who braided her hair and told her stories and held her without being asked." He turned back to the judge. "I have asked Miss Bennett to be my wife. She has accepted. We will be married. And I am standing here today to tell this court in this community that my daughter is safe, my daughter is loved, and nobody, not Margaret Caldwell, not this court, not anyone is going to take her from her home." Silence. The kind that settles after something true has been spoken in a place where truth is rare. Then Reverend Isaac Whitmore stood. The old preacher rose slowly from a bench near the back, his white hair catching the afternoon light. He had not been asked to speak. He had not been summoned. He simply stood because his conscience required it. "I have visited Whispering Creek Ranch," he said, his voice carrying the practiced authority of 60 years of sermons. "I have seen what Caleb describes. I have seen the child smile. I have watched Miss Bennett with the girl, and I have seen what 3 years of grief look like when they finally begin to lift." He looked directly at Margaret. "I believe that the Lord sometimes guides people to where they are needed by roads that make no sense to us. A wrong address, a broken axle, a stagecoach that stops at the wrong gate. These are small things, but the Lord works through small things." He turned to the judge. "I will officiate the wedding myself if they will have me, and I will stand before this community and say that Nettie Henshaw is exactly where she belongs." Then Jake Pruitt stood. Jake, who barely spoke 10 words in a day. Jake, who had worked Whispering Creek Ranch for 15 years. Jake, who had watched Ellen live and watched Ellen die and watched Caleb nearly follow her into the ground. "I have been on that ranch since before Caleb was married," he said, his voice rough as unplaned lumber. "I saw Ellen. I saw what she brought to that house. Light. That is what I would call it. Light. He paused and looked at his boots. When she died, the light went out. For 3 years, that house has been dark. Caleb kept it standing, but he could not keep it lit. Nobody could have. You cannot build a fire with one hand. He looked up. His eyes were red but dry. Then this girl showed up, dropped off by a stagecoach with a busted manifest and $3 to her name. And inside of a week, there was light again. Nettie laughing, bread baking, curtains washed, songs in the kitchen. He turned to Margaret. Mrs. Caldwell has never set foot on Whispering Creek Ranch to visit that child. Not once in 3 years. She sent food nobody asked for and offers nobody wanted because she was not interested in the girl. She was interested in the land. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Margaret's face went rigid. The land and the man on it, Jake finished. That is the truth of it. And everybody in this town knows it, whether they have the spine to say it or not. Judge Briggs removed his spectacles and cleaned them slowly on his handkerchief. He looked at his notes. He looked at Margaret. He looked at Caleb and Rosalie and the small crowd of people who had gathered to watch. I have heard enough, he said. He folded his notes and placed them in his coat pocket. The petition is denied. I find no evidence of an improper environment and no basis for further review. The child remains with her father. He paused and looked at Margaret over the rims of his spectacles. Mrs. Caldwell, I would advise you to direct your considerable energies toward your own business and leave the raising of other people's children to those who have earned the right to do so. Margaret's mouth opened, then closed. She looked at the crowd, at the faces that were no longer neutral, at the neighbors who were no longer whispering, but watching her with the clear, unblinking gaze of people who have finally decided whose side they are on. She gathered her skirts. She turned. She walked to her carriage without a word. The two hired men followed. The carriage rolled away down Main Street, and the dust it raised settled slowly in the autumn air. And that was the last time Margaret Caldwell came to Whispering Creek Ranch or spoke Nettie Henshaw's name in public. Through all of it, Nettie had been standing at the edge of the crowd, half hidden behind the children's table, her basket of ribbons clutched against her chest. She had heard everything. She had understood more than any adult there would have credited a 6-year-old with understanding. And when the judge spoke his final words, Nettie did not wait. She ran, not to her father, not to the judge, not to the reverend, or to Jake. The kind that does not come from letters or promises. The kind that is built slowly and stubbornly from shared meals and mended fences and a child's small hand reaching for yours in the dark. They were married 2 weeks later in Cedar Ridge on a Tuesday afternoon when the sky was so blue it looked like it had been painted. Reverend Whitmore stood beneath the open sky because Rosalie had asked for no walls between them and the land that would be their home. A handful of neighbors stood witness. Jake Pruitt stood at the back, arms folded across his chest, eyes red, pretending he had dust in them. Nettie stood at the front. She wore a white dress, small and simple, that Rosalie had sewn by hand from fabric she found in Ellen's sewing chest. She had asked Caleb before she cut the first piece. He had looked at the fabric for a long time, running his fingers over the weave. Then he had nodded once and walked away. And Rosalie understood that the nod meant yes, and it also meant thank you, and it also meant that some gifts are too important for words. Nettie held a bouquet of wildflowers, purple and yellow and white, picked that morning from the meadow behind the barn. She held them with both hands, arms extended, the way children hold things they consider monumentally important. When the Reverend finished the vows and Caleb kissed Rosalie, a kiss so brief and gentle, it was more promise than passion, Nettie did not wait for permission. She launched herself forward like a small comet with pigtails. Now you are really my mama, she declared, her voice ringing with the absolute, unshakable conviction that only a child can summon. Rosalie knelt on the ground in her wedding dress in the dirt of Cedar Ridge and gathered Nettie into her arms. Yes, she whispered, if you will have me. Nettie pulled back just far enough to look at her with those enormous brown eyes. I already have, she said. I have had you since the first day. Caleb stood behind them. He looked at his daughter. He looked at his wife. And for the first time since Ellen Henshaw closed her eyes for the last time in a cabin buried under Montana snow, Caleb Henshaw smiled with his whole face. Not the guarded half smile he rationed out like provisions. A real smile. the kind that starts somewhere deep in the chest and rises through the body like warmth from a fire that has finally caught. Jake saw it and turned away quickly, pulling his hat down over his eyes. The Reverend saw it and quietly closed his Bible because some things are more sacred than Scripture. And Nettie saw it and grinned because she had known all along. She had known from the moment she saw Rosalie standing in the dust with a suitcase and a lost expression and something in her eyes that looked exactly like the something that had been missing from their house. She had known the way children know things without evidence or argument or reason. She had known the way the heart knows what the mind has not yet figured out. Mama was home. Life at Whispering Creek Ranch did not turn easy overnight. The work was still hard. Montana winters still came sharp and long, with winds that could strip the warmth from a cabin and the will from a body. Fences still broke. Calves still wandered. The land demanded everything and gave back only what it chose to give on its own schedule in its own time. But the house was different. Laughter filled rooms that had held only silence. Suppers were shared without loneliness pressing against the windows like a face in the dark. He told stories she had not heard before, stories about winters spent alone in the high country when he was young, about the first time he saw Ellen at a trading post and asked her if she knew anything about raising cattle, about the night Nettie was born, and his hands shook so badly he could barely hold the knife to cut the cord. He told these stories not because he had suddenly become talkative, but because for the first time in 3 years there was someone to tell them to. And Rosalie listened. She did not try to replace Ellen. She did not rearrange the photograph on the shelf. She left the chipped teacup exactly where it sat. She built something new beside the old, the way a second tree grows next to the first without diminishing it. One morning several months after the wedding, a letter arrived with Jake from Cedar Ridge. Rosalie was kneading bread when Jake handed her the small brown envelope. She wiped her hands on her apron and opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a clipping from a territorial newspaper. The headline read, "Virgil Doss escapes Wyoming Territorial Prison. Authorities warn he may flee west." Below the headline was a short paragraph describing the escape. Doss had overpowered a guard during a transfer between facilities. He had disappeared into the wilderness. Authorities believed he was heading west toward Montana or Idaho, where he had previously operated. Rosalie read the article twice. She folded it carefully, placed it in her apron pocket, and stood very still for a moment, looking out the kitchen window at the mountains. She had built a new life. She had found a husband and a daughter and a home. She had survived a con man's scheme and a spiteful widow's campaign and a county judge's scrutiny. She had stood in the dust of a wrong ranch and chosen to stay. And now the man who had written the letters that brought her here, the man whose scheme had nearly destroyed her, was loose somewhere in the territory. She pressed her hand flat against the pocket where the newspaper clipping lay. She felt the sharp edges of the paper through the fabric. Then she looked out the window again. She saw Nettie in the yard throwing a stick for the barn cat who did not understand fetch, but was willing to humor the child. She saw Caleb by the fence hammering a post into the hard earth with the steady rhythmic blows that had become the heartbeat of her life. She took a breath. She walked outside. Caleb saw her coming. He set down the hammer. He looked at her face and knew instantly that something had changed. Not because her expression was dramatic. Caleb Henshaw did not respond to drama. He responded to subtlety. And the subtlety in Rosalie's face, the faint tightening around her eyes, the way her hand pressed against her apron pocket, was enough. She handed him the clipping without a word. He read it. His jaw tightened. He folded the paper and handed it back. "He will not come here," Caleb said. "You do not know that." "No, I do not. But if he does, he will find something he did not expect." He looked at her, steady, certain, the eyes of a mountain man who had spent his entire life facing things that could kill him and choosing to face them anyway. "He will find a family." Rosalie nodded. She put the clipping back in her pocket. She did not mention it again that day, or the next, or the day after that. But that evening she noticed Caleb cleaned his rifle after supper. He checked the locks on the doors. He stood on the porch for a long time looking at the tree line before coming to bed. He did not tell her not to worry. He was not that kind of man. He simply prepared. And his preparation was its own form of promise. Whatever comes, we face it. Together. One evening as autumn began its slow surrender to winter, Rosalie stood at the edge of the pasture and watched Caleb teach Nettie how to throw a lariat. The rope sailed through the air in an uneven loop and landed on the fence post with more luck than skill. Nettie shrieked with delight. Caleb shook his head and showed her the wrist motion, again patient as stone. The sky above Montana stretched wide and endless, painted in shades of pink and gold, and the deep bruised purple that comes just before the stars appear. Rosalie thought back to the moment the stagecoach had rolled away. Standing alone in a cloud of red dust, with $3 in a suitcase and the ruins of a plan that had never been real. She had believed her life was over. She had believed she had been foolish. Instead, she had been delivered to the wrong ranch. And that wrong ranch had given her everything she had once prayed for. Caleb walked toward her, Nettie running ahead, laughter trailing behind her like a ribbon caught in the wind. "Papa says I can help with the calves tomorrow," Nettie announced, breathless and beaming. "We will see about that," Rosalie replied with a smile. Nettie grinned up at her. "Mama always says that." Caleb reached Rosalie and slipped his hand into hers. His palm was rough and warm. His grip was firm but gentle. The grip of a man who had learned that strength is not about how hard you hold on. It is about knowing what is worth holding. The prairie wind moved softly through the tall grass. The last light of day settled on the mountains like a blessing. And Rosalie looked out across the land that no longer felt strange, the land that held her home, her husband, her child. Sometimes the road you choose disappears beneath your feet. Sometimes the letter you trust leads nowhere. But sometimes the wrong destination is the very place you were meant to find. And here is a lesson worth carrying with you. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is not to fight. It is to stay. It is to say yes when the whole world says run. It is to believe you are worthy of love even after you have been deceived. Let me ask you something. When was the last time you ended up somewhere you did not plan to be and found something you did not know you were looking for? When was the last time the wrong turn led you to the right place? If this story meant something to you, a like goes further than you might think. Share it with someone who needs to hear it, someone who is standing in their own cloud of dust, wondering if they made the wrong choice. Subscribe for more stories like this one. And leave a comment. Where are you watching from right now? What time is it where you are? I read every single one. Because one wrong address turned a girl with nothing into a mother, a wife, and the heart of a home she never dared to dream of. And as the first stars appeared in the wide Montana sky, and the lamp in the window of Whispering Creek Ranch burned golden against the coming dark, Rosalie Bennett Henshaw knew one simple truth. She had arrived exactly where she belonged, and it is never too late to find your way home.